Hello, and welcome back to Missouri Civil War. As we learned last time, the Missouri Compromise was a pivotal moment, not only for the state, but also for the entire republic. Missouri became a state, slavery remained legal within it, and Congress prohibited the spread of slavery into the West, that is, to most of the Louisiana Purchase. This compromise eased sectional tensions, at least for the moment, and it seemed to settle the fate of slavery in the Western territories. But as we will see in today's second lecture, the ensuing decades revived the issue once again. And amid a worsening sectional crisis, Missourians stood once more at the flashpoint between the defenders and the critics of slavery. We begin today by looking at Missouri's remarkable growth through the 1850s and its role as the gateway to the American West. Immigration now brought greater diversity to the state, which sometimes sparked violence between settlers. Slaveholders within the Democratic Party strengthened their dominance within Missouri politics, and by 1850, they urged Congress to allow slavery's spread beyond the western border. The power of this pro-slavery faction was especially evident after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The doctrine of popular sovereignty within that act now allowed Western settlers themselves to determine the fate of slavery in the territories. Missourians supported this, and they moved aggressively in the struggle for Kansas territory. And the political violence that would soon erupt there captured the nation's attention. Missouri was front-page news. And Civil War, it seemed, had come to the West. After gaining statehood, Missouri experienced incredible population growth. In the 1820s, during its first decade of statehood, the population doubled. In the 1830s, it almost tripled. In the 1840s, and then again in the next decade, it nearly doubled again. This period saw settlers expand to virtually every corner of the state. The largest number of residents continued to come from the Upper South, but an extraordinary diversity of people flocked to St. Louis, which was fast becoming the most important city in the American West. Thousands of German immigrants relocated to Missouri, many of them drawn to the rolling countryside along the great rivers, drawn by the glowing reports of Gottfried Duden and prior visitors. During the 1830s, several thousand members of Joseph Smith's Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints arrived in western Missouri. Smith was the prophet of this new Mormon church. He believed that Jackson County, Missouri, near present-day Kansas City, would become the location of his followers' New Zion. Violence and intimidation from other settlers, though, soon forced Smith's followers to flee into Clay County to the north, and then up to Caldwell County, which was created as a kind of Mormon refuge. Yet as the Mormon population grew and then spilled into neighboring counties, rising tensions eventually erupted into open warfare. This so-called Mormon War in 1838 reached its climax, and Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs decided that the LDS members were the problem. He issued a notorious extermination order. The Mormons, he wrote, must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state. Mormon settlers quickly moved across the Mississippi to Nauvoo, Illinois, but again violence and also the assassination of Joseph Smith forced them to relocate once more, this time out to the arid lands near the Great Salt Lake. The Mormon story is a troubling but significant part of Missouri history. You may wonder, why is he talking about this? The Civil War is decades away, but the story of the Mormons reminds us that Missouri was, in so many cases, a violent place well before the Civil War. The Mormon expulsion is also a precursor, an ominous precursor of the vigilantism and the dispossession that will unfold on a much wider scale during the early 1860s. The territory to Missouri's immediate west remained off limits to legal settlement. Stretched along a string of forts from Minnesota in the north to Louisiana in the south, the U.S. Army policed this region as what they called a permanent Indian frontier. Behind it sat the tribes displaced from the eastern United States. And Missouri's western border therefore became a kind of demographic dam, holding back the tide of western expansion. By 1840, the ideology of manifest destiny, which held that it was America's divine mission to spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific, manifest destiny puts real pressure upon this demographic dam. And you can see it beginning to crack in 1837. In that year, Missouri will acquire those northwestern counties near St. Joseph, purchasing them from local Native Americans, adding roughly 3,000 square miles to the territory. Even greater proof of this expansionism comes with the development of major overland trails. And this is the way in which you see Missouri clearly emerging as the gateway to the West. Missouri becomes the jumping off point for the Santa Fe Trail, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail. Missouri towns will become the provisioning depots for traders and settlers and missionaries and all sorts of thrill-seeking adventurers. Towns like Independence and Franklin, they become the jumping off point. Missouri also plays a key role in the early history of Texas. Moses Austin had made and then lost his fortune in the lead mines of the Ozarks, and he had looked to build a colony in Spanish-speaking Tejas, but when he fell ill, it was his son, Stephen F. Austin, who will carry forward his father's vision, bringing with him a number of Missourians southward to Texas. By the 1840s, slavery was becoming well established in the state. There were slaves held in every county. And although the majority of households in Missouri did not own slaves, most white Missourians at this time accepted the ownership of slaves as a right protected by the U.S. Constitution. Enslaved Missourians represented about 10% of the state's population, and the largest number of slaves lived in the counties of the central Missouri Valley along the Great River. Farms in this Little Dixie region focused not on the production of cotton, which was the main cash crop in the Deep South, but on Missouri farms they grew tobacco and hemp, which was used primarily to make the rope needed to bale cotton. And in this way, the big rivers bound Missouri slaveholders in the north to the rapidly expanding cotton kingdom in the south. And so they're both developing in parallel ways. Most masters in Missouri owned few slaves. And for these small slaveholders, their human property was both an economic asset, which allowed their shops or their farms to be more productive, but it was also a sign of their social and political status. The wealthiest slaveholders were widely recognized as Missouri's elite. Although the slave-owning aristocracy was relatively small in Missouri, it was never as large as it was in Virginia or Mississippi or elsewhere. This aristocracy dominated state politics during the antebellum period. Their so-called central clique within the Democratic Party largely hailed from the Boonslick, that region I described last time. They worked not only to protect slavery in Missouri, but also to extend it into the Western territories. These men, for example, were enthusiastic supporters of the Mexican War. When Democratic Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who had been the Democratic lion from Missouri for decades, when Benton expressed reservation about the spread of slavery beyond the state, this central clique orchestrated the swift end to Benton's distinguished career. The ascent of this powerful pro-slavery faction was never clearer than in the period following the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Orchestrated by Illinois Democrat Stephen Douglas, the Kansas-Nebraska Act organized and opened for settlement two territories just west of Missouri, Kansas to the south and Nebraska to the north. And if you look at them on the map, they're much, much larger, the original territories, than the states you know today. Nebraska stretches all the way up into the Dakotas and into Montana. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, most importantly, overturns the Missouri Compromise. It opens these territories up for the potential of slavery because the fate of that institution would be voted upon by the settlers who lived there, not by Congress. This was an idea known as popular sovereignty, and Missourians supported this widely. Slaveholding Missourians looked at the prospect of a free Kansas territory, one without slavery, one that had been kept free under the Missouri Compromise. They saw it as a kind of existential threat because if a free Kansas were to happen, Missouri would be surrounded by free soil on basically all sides except to the south. And by the mid-1850s, the problem of fugitive slaves running away and gaining their freedom, it had reached crisis proportions, at least in the minds of Missouri masters. Each year, hundreds of slaves escaped bondage by fleeing Maryland and Kentucky and Virginia and Missouri to the adjacent free states. And if you know Missouri geography, south of Kansas City, that's an open border. There's no natural barrier between slave territory and free. And this anxiety about a free Kansas was palpable amongst many Missourians. Many of these fugitives received help from anti-slavery activists, the Underground Railroad, small number of abolitionists, free people of color. And Missouri slaveholders worried that if abolitionists somehow took control of Kansas, the fate of slavery in Missouri itself was imperiled. In 1850, Congress passed a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, and this law made the federal government a key factor in protecting their slave property. This law matters it's a big deal because in the Civil War, there will be in Missouri a significant number of loyal slaveholders, conservative people who support the Union but also owned slaves, who believed that under the Fugitive Slave Law, the federal government would be there to protect their property. And thanks to their geographic proximity to Kansas territory, a lot of Missourians will slip across the state line and claim some of the best lands there before the ink on the law was actually dry. This pro-slavery faction, consisting mostly of Missourians, seemed a heavy favorite to claim power in Kansas. But what happens in Kansas is that the Missourians there, they overplay their hand. In the first territorial elections, you see this. On November 29, 1854, a pro-slavery candidate, J.W. Whitfield, recently of Jackson County, Missouri, receives about 80% of the votes cast. He owed his remarkable margin of victory to an estimated 1,700 Missourians who crossed the state line that day for the purpose of electing him. Months later, another election is even more obvious. There had been a territorial census that found about 2,900 eligible voters living in the territory of Kansas. But on March 29, 1855, there were 6,307 votes cast, with 5,400 of them going to the pro-slavery candidate. So 2,900 people thereabouts could be voting, 6,300 were counted. And so it seemed quite the voting irregularity. And among the thousands of Missourians who had voted that day, professing to be Kansans, was Missouri's United States Senator, David Rice Atchison, and its future governor, Claiborne Fox Jackson, who was a member of that central clique. And so a cloud of illegitimacy hangs over Kansas territory from the start, or it hangs over the pro-slavery faction in Kansas territory. These pro-slavery leaders will implement Missouri laws in Kansas, just substituting the word Kansas for Missouri and territory for state. They'll implement its slave code. And then they will implement a ridiculously harsh series of punishments. These provisions included a measure that stated any resident caught helping a fugitive slave would be punished by death, or could be punished by death. People who circulated anti-slavery publications faced up to 5 years in prison. Those who refused to swear an oath in support of that federal fugitive slave law, they would lose the right to vote. And these punitive measures taken by the government in Lecompton, coupled with the appearances of voting fraud, this stokes outrage across the United States. And so attention is right there on the western frontier. In time, a growing number of free soil immigrants arrive in Kansas. Most of these anti-slavery settlers did not identify themselves as abolitionists. That still seemed very radical. The idea of racial egalitarianism was too much for them, and so they criticized slavery on economic grounds. They wanted to keep Kansas free for poor whites like themselves to be able to work free of competition against slave labor. Free soil Kansans will establish a territorial government of their own at Topeka, and whether you call it illegal or extra-legal, you quickly have in Kansas a peculiar situation two rival governments, neither of which is fully legitimate in the eyes of its enemies. It's akin to what will happen in Missouri during the Civil War. The pro-slavery faction in Kansas enjoys the upper hand through 1856. They will harass the pro-slavery partisans, their enemies, with impunity, hoping to drive them from Kansas territory. In May of 1856, partisan fighting in Kansas leads to actual bloodshed. A mob, consisting mostly of Missourians, will sack the town of Lawrence, which was Kansas's noted hotbed of abolitionism. Days later, a recent arrival named John Brown conducted a nighttime raid along Pottawatomie Creek. John Brown's men will seize 5 pro-slavery settlers from the cabins. These were not slave owners, but were men who had known to be supporting the pro-slavery government. And Brown's men will seize them, drag them from the cabins, and murder them, and then mutilate their bodies with broadswords. And this Pottawatomie massacre sets off years of guerrilla violence along the Kansas-Missouri line. Several factors will fuel this: economic rivalry, divisions over slavery, obviously, fierce demands for vengeance. This violence captures the nation's attention. It becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. And it suggested that political differences in America had broken wide open. It seemed to have devolved into the dangerous scenario that Jefferson himself had feared years earlier. Stephen Douglas had placed his great hopes in popular sovereignty. His idea was that bringing more democracy to the West, rather than letting Washington dictate its future, that might provide a way out of this slavery morass. Yet this seemed democracy run amok. And as I've written about the struggles in Kansas and Missouri in my book, The Border Between Them, I often ask crowds, who started this mess? Was it pro-slavery Missourians or free soil Kansans that deserves the blame? I found that the answers I get differ depending upon which side of the state line I ask. So people are still divided about this. But what is clear is that by the 1850s, civil war had begun on the western prairies. It was not yet a national war, but it was certainly an ominous prelude of things to come. By 1857, a flood of free soil immigrants poured into Kansas from Illinois, Indiana, Iowa. These newcomers soon outnumbered their pro-slavery neighbors, and within a year, the Free State faction had triumphed. Missourians' struggle to extend slavery into Kansas had failed, raising anxieties about the institution's future within their own state. In our next video, we will consider the fate of slavery within Missouri, looking at the saga of one man, Dred Scott, who becomes part of the most important, and I would say most notorious Supreme Court case in American history. Until then.